Why are we so terrified by horror films? Since its inception, the horror film has been designed to instill fear and terror in the viewer. But the question is, how do creative practitioners in the horror genre actually provoke such intense reactions? And what are the kinds of themes that they use to prey upon our anxiety as a viewer? There are many technical aspects that really make horror into the genre that it is today, but while the technicality of horror is significant, screenwriting in the genre is just as important and influential. Now, let's hear from some practitioners in the horror field about their thoughts and feelings on the horror genre and some of the films that they believe are exemplary in inspiring fear and terror within the viewer. This is the Horror Deep Dive.
Horror is it's such a broad term when you're talking about horror as a genre in cinema. It's hard to define, but I guess the easiest explanation of it is fear of something unknown. Is your film sort of like, is it the Blumhouse school of horror that's going to probably be dependent on a lot of fast takes and sound effects to sort of provoke a jump scare, and sort of to a degree probably playing with audiences not super familiar with the genre, or whether in fact the film you're trying to make is more something that's in maybe the school of A24 these days, that's sort of more of a dread, sense of dread, really atmospheric sort of film where you're kind of lost in the film itself and you kind of forget about someone popping up behind a tree or anything like that. It could happen, but the way it's going to happen is that the shots are going to be much slower. They're going to lull you into this false sense of security or just general fear that you're just on the edge of your seat waiting for something to happen, but you don't know when it's going to happen. Like Hereditary, when are you gonna know, when's that boy gonna face his parents and tell them what happened to his sister? You're just sitting there waiting, going, God, this is really uncomfortable. And part of that is not only just these extreme sort of long takes and knowing how long to hold that shot for and before cutting to the next. It's also about queuing up the right music as well. And I think we're seeing a lot of that sort of A24 sort of styled horror going toward minimalism when it comes to composition in the music.
The soundscapes of horror obviously are designed to set us on edge, and the relationship, I think, between silence and music and sound is particularly characteristic of horror. The infamous jump scare is so much a creation of sound, maybe even more so than images. It's just a sensory assault via a sudden loud jolt of sound. So sound for me is a really, really big one. And when I think of the horror movies that creep me out the most, they do tend to have a really, really effective sound design and so interesting, sometimes even blurry boundaries between the music and the diegetic sound. So even Eraserhead is an interesting example of that. There's so much industrial kind of whirring and droning in Eraserhead, which you don't know whether it's meant to be part of the musical score or it's diegetic sound, which is really unsettling. One of my other favorite horror movies, The Ring, also does that very nicely. Gore Verbinski's The Ring. They have these really weird kind of electronic noises throughout that sometimes play the role of non-diegetic musical soundtrack, but sometimes it's kind of ambiguous whether or not they're coming from the story world of the film. I love the way cinematography is often used in horror to obfuscate the audience's perspective. So we're used to having quite this mastery of vision, which is what a lot of screen scholars have written about, but being able to have a really clear perspective on everything that's going on, this kind of omniscient perspective when we're watching a film. But horror is so good at kind of obscuring our vision at key moments so that we only see something horrifying at the exact right moment to provoke dread or horror. So, you know, another great example of both sound and this kind of cinematography and editing is a scene from Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds, where someone arrives home and sees that there's some smashed kind of mugs in the house, so realizes something's not quite right, but doesn't know what, and she kind of heads down the hallway. There's no music whatsoever up, and it's a very mundane scene. Then she just opens the door and we get a series of kind of jump cuts that move into a close-up of someone who's had their eyes pecked out, so they've just got these bloody eye sockets left, and there's no music. The character doesn't scream. The work is all done by this slow reveal of what we see in this very mundane setting through the cinematography and the editing, and these three cuts that move into a close-up rather than the usual zoom in that we might expect. And even just seeing her reaction, she kind of opens her mouth but doesn't scream and runs out of the house. The silence is what really emphasizes the fact that this was unexpected and just happened all of a sudden in this mundane kind of scene. Maniac, the remake, was absolutely brilliant. I loved the first person perspective in that, which kind of really put a new twist on the serial killer narrative. And again, I guess used those technical elements, ingredients of filmmaking to play with the audience's sense of safety and threat.
The movies, the type of movies that scare me these days are the things that are set sort of in the real world. Eden's Lake, and that was a movie that stressed me out. I was just chilled to the core. You know, it was the setup of, you know, to a couple that go camping, you know, in a really remote place, and then they're slowly sort of taunted and terrorized by this group of youths, and then they end up basically becoming the prey of these youths, and it's just horrific. But that fear of like some kids not knowing, and you do see on the news like kids pulling knives and stabbing some young, you know, youth, you know, that's 17. And so watching some of these films with these real characters that, you know, you kind of go, this isn't Jason, this isn't Freddy, this isn't Michael, this isn't an icon of the genre. This is a kid you could pass in the street, or a grown man or woman or whomever, that you could pass in the street and you have no idea what's going on in their head. And you know, and what will take them for that switch to flip, and for them to do something, you know, really inhuman. And so films like Eden's Lake, or the French film Ills, or even Brian Bettino's The Strangers, when you find out that they're kids all along. So the idea of like myself and my wife being terrorized by a gang of youths, that's terrifying. I mean, like Funny Games as well, that's terrifying. You know, those are the things that scare me the most. The things that, it's not the horror that's, you know, happening overseas, or the horror that's going to come from the sky or from the ground. It's the one that's around the corner from you. You know, that could be anyone that lives next to me or down the street, you know. And that real life terror is something else.
Like haunted media horror movies so much, they mess with our sense of safety and threat, because the villain, the ghost, the boogeyman, Bagul as it is in Sinister, could potentially co-opt the media we're consuming the horror film through to terrorize us, the audience, as well. I love when horror movies do that. There are so many horror movies that I do think are exemplary when it comes to manifesting fear. I already mentioned, I think, Scott Derrickson's Sinister. And it was featured in a scientific study a few years ago, I think, for being, I can't remember the details of this study, but it was named like the scariest movie ever according to science, because they had done, I think, audience kind of research and measured people's sensory reactions and emotions, and found that Sinister created the most extreme reactions. And for me, Sinister is a really effective horror film, because it uses all those elements I've already talked about. So the kind of haunted media conceit, coupled with this amazing sound design and music and cinematography to make the audience feel unsafe. So we very much are welded to the protagonist's kind of plight in that film, because the threat is that, you know, we are also being affected by these kind of cursed, I think it's Super 8 video videos that he watches in the course, Super 8 films, home movies that he watches in the course of that film. So yes, Sinister, I think, is very effective, as I've already mentioned Ring and The Ring, the American remake. Again, they play with that haunted media conceit so well, so that by the end of the film, we're kind of left unsure about our own safety as well. So the Ring's conceit obviously is that there's a cursed videotape that people have to copy and pass on, otherwise they're going to be cursed by the film's ghost and die in 7 days. So the Gore Verbinski's American remake, I remember, ends with this amazing scene of Naomi Watts's character kind of helping her son go through the motions of copying and copying that tape, ready to show it to someone else so they can avoid the curse. And then the last thing we see is the son kind of asking, who are we going to show it to? And then we just kind of get this slight side eye from Naomi Watts's character. And then we see glimpses of this super surreal and unsettling curse tape, all of a sudden accompanied by a loud jolt of kind of static that ends the film. So obviously the suggestion is we, the audience, are the next victims because we've watched the curse tape in the course of that film. So yeah, again, when films really play with the haunted media conceit effectively, that for me really it creates that sense of dread and threat that I crave in horror movies.